Ezekiel Thornfield stood in the dim cabin, holding his last clean shirt between calloused hands. The fabric had torn beyond repair. His reflection stared back from a cracked mirror mounted on the wall, showing a man who had let everything fall. Apart, the door slammed behind Murphy, his final ranch hand. The sound echoed through the empty rooms like a gunshot. Murphy's words still hung in the cold air about running a ranch while looking like a vagrant. About cattle wandering off because even they had lost respect for their owner. Snow began to fall outside the window. Winter was coming early this year. The banknote sat on his table, stamped with red ink. 3 months. That's all the time he had left before they took everything. Zeke pulled on his torn shirt anyway. The fabric caught on his shoulder, opening the rip wider. He stared at the damage, then at his hands. These same hands had once mended harnesses and fixed fence posts. Now they shook when he tried to thread a needle. The ride to Cedar Falls took longer than usual. His horse picked her way carefully through the early snow, breathing clouds of steam in the thin air. The town looked smaller each time he visited, as if it were slowly disappearing into the mountains. Voices drifted from the general store as he tied his horse to the post. Townspeople always had something to say about someone. Today their whispers carried a different weight. A widow woman with 3 young ones. Doing mending work for scraps, too proud to beg but near starving. Zeke pushed through the door. The bell jangled overhead, announcing his presence to the handful of customers inside. They glanced at him, then looked away. His reputation preceded him everywhere now. At the counter stood a woman in a worn brown dress. Her dark hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that had seen too much hardship for her years. She held a small bundle of mended clothes, negotiating with the shopkeeper in a voice that carried quiet dignity despite her circumstances. 3 faces pressed against the window outside. 2 girls who looked to be twins, one staring dreamily at the sky while the other watched every person who passed. Behind them stood a boy of 15 or 16, his arms crossed and his expression hard as granite. The woman finished her transaction, accepting a small sack of flour in exchange for her work. She clutched a folded letter in her other hand, quickly tucking it into her coat when she noticed Zeke watching. He approached the counter after she moved away. His boots sounded too loud on the wooden floor. The shopkeeper looked up expectantly. Zeke cleared his throat. The words came out rougher than he intended. That woman, she does mending work. The shopkeeper nodded. Mrs. Brightwater, fine needlework, though she and those children are hanging on by a thread. Been sleeping in the livery stable since they arrived last week. Zeke watched through the window as the woman rejoined her children. The boy's hostile expression softened slightly when he looked at his mother, but his shoulders remained tense. The twins flanked her like small guards. She looking for steady work. It wasn't a question. The shopkeeper confirmed it anyway. Winter's coming. They need shelter more than coins. Zeke bought his supplies in silence. Flour, coffee, some canned goods. Enough to last through the cold months if he was careful. The weight of his decision settled on him like snow accumulating on a roof. He found them outside the livery stable. The woman was dividing the flour into smaller portions, making sure each child understood how long it needed to last. The boy was arguing in hushed tones about finding work. The practical twin was calculating something in a small notebook. The dreamy one was building a tiny snowman from the accumulating flakes. Zeke approached slowly. The boy stepped forward, putting himself between Zeke and his family. His jaw was set like a man's, though his frame still carried the awkwardness of youth. The woman looked up. Her eyes were the color of winter grass, sharp and watchful. She waited for him to speak first. I have work, mending and such. Basic household keeping. Her expression didn't change. What kind of work? Clothes need fixing. House needs tending. Nothing more than that. The boy's hostility radiated like heat from a fire. The practical twin had stopped writing and was studying Zeke with uncomfortable intensity. The dreamy one continued building her snowman, but her ears were clearly listening. "Room and board," Zeke continued. "Through winter, maybe longer if it works out." The woman glanced at her children, then back at him. Her pride warred with necessity. In the space of a heartbeat, necessity won. "What's your name?" "Ezekiel Thornfield. Got a ranch about 10 miles north." She nodded once. "Cordelia Brightwater. These are my children. Samuel, Mercy, and Grace." The boy, Samuel, stepped closer. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been forced to grow up too fast. "What's in it for you?" Zeke met his stare. "Clean clothes, decent meals." "Nothing more complicated than that." The lie came easily. Everything about this arrangement was complicated. Taking in a family meant noise and questions and the constant reminder of what he had lost. But his alternative was freezing alone in a house that smelled like failure. Cordelia made her decision. "We'll come. But this is business. Nothing more." She was lying too. Zeke could see it in the way she held herself, the careful distance she maintained. They were both desperate people making desperate choices, pretending it was anything else. The snow fell harder as they gathered their few possessions. Samuel threw his mother's mending basket into their small wagon with more force than necessary. The twins climbed up beside it, Mercy still clutching her tiny snowman while Grace opened her notebook again. Cordelia took the reins. Her hands were steady despite everything. Zeke mounted his horse and led the way north, toward his failing ranch and the uncertain winter ahead. Behind him, he heard Samuel mutter something about hermits who couldn't take care of themselves. Grace shushed him quietly. Mercy began humming a tune that got lost in the wind. None of them spoke about the letter Cordelia kept hidden in her coat. None of them mentioned the way Zeke's hands shook when he talked about his empty house. They were all running from something, toward something, pretending it was just business. The snow covered their tracks as they disappeared into the mountains. The ranch house crouched against the mountainside like a wounded animal. Broken shutters hung at crook angles. The porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips that fluttered in the wind. Zeke dismounted and stood beside the wagon. He watched Cordelia's face as she took in the full scope of his failure. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but her knuckles whitened where she gripped the reins. Samuel jumped down from the wagon bed. His boots hit the frozen ground with a sound that carried judgment. "This is what you call a ranch." The words hung in the cold air. Zeke felt them settle between his shoulder blades. He had grown used to his own disappointment, but seeing it reflected in a stranger's eyes cut deeper than expected. Grace climbed down more carefully, her notebook clutched against her chest. She surveyed the buildings with the methodical attention of someone cataloging problems. Mercy remained in the wagon, staring up at the mountains that rose behind the house like stone guardians. Cordelia set the brake and climbed down. Her movements were precise, economical. She had learned not to waste energy on things that couldn't be changed. "The loft has space for you and the children," Zeke said. "I'll stay downstairs." He pushed open the front door. The hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of a man who had stopped caring about tomorrow. Dishes sat unwashed in the basin. Clothes lay scattered across furniture that had seen better decades. Samuel stepped inside and surveyed the wreckage. "Hermit who can't even take care of himself." The words were meant to wound. "They found their mark." Zeke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He had invited this judgment when he invited them in. Cordelia moved through the room, assessing what needed attention. Her trained eye cataloged the work ahead. Mending, cleaning, organizing. The tasks that would transform this house from shelter into home. "We'll need water," she said. Zeke pointed toward the kitchen. "Pump works, well's good." Grace had already found the ladder to the loft. She climbed up and disappeared into the darkness above. Her voice drifted down, neutral and factual. "It's clean up here, cold, but clean." Mercy finally spoke, her voice soft as falling snow. "Where are your family?" The question hit like a physical blow. Zeke turned toward the window, unable to meet her innocent eyes. "Don't have any. Everyone has family somewhere." "Not anymore," Samuel snorted. "Figures." Cordelia shot her son a warning look. The boy's hostility was a shield, she knew, but it served no one in their current circumstances. They needed this arrangement to work. The next 3 days passed in careful choreography. Each person moved through the house like dancers who had not yet learned each other's steps. Boundaries were established through silence and avoidance. Cordelia took over the kitchen. Her presence transformed the space from neglect into function. Meals appeared at regular intervals. Coffee grew stronger. The smell of bread began to replace the stale air of abandonment. Grace mapped the house in her notebook. She recorded everything: broken hinges, cracked windows, gaps in the walls where wind whistled through. Her observations were thorough and damning. Mercy tried different approaches. With Zeke, she would appear beside him while he worked, asking questions that hung unanswered in the air. Where did the cattle graze? What were the mountains called? Why did he live so far from town? Zeke answered with grunts and gestures. Words had become foreign things, unwieldy in his mouth after years of disuse. Samuel made his contempt clear through action. He repaired the porch steps without being asked, his hammer blows carrying more force than necessary. Each strike seemed to say what his voice did not: that a man who let his home fall apart could not be trusted with anything important. The fourth night brought the blizzard. Wind roared down from the peaks with the fury of something unleashed. Snow drove horizontal across the valley, turning the world white and shapeless. The house shuddered under the assault. Zeke had seen storms like this before. They could last 3 days or more, trapping anyone foolish enough to be caught unprepared. He moved through the house, checking windows and reinforcing the door. The family watched him work, finally seeing competence in his movements. By morning, snow had drifted against the windows. The door opened onto a wall of white that reached above Samuel's head. They were buried, trapped together in a space too small for the careful distances they had maintained. The second day of the storm, Mercy found the letters. She had been exploring the loft when her foot caught on a loose board. Underneath lay a bundle of envelopes, tied with string that had gone gray with age. The handwriting on the outside was different from letter to letter, but all were addressed to the same person: Ezekiel Thornfield, from his brothers. She climbed down with the bundle clutched against her chest. Zeke was feeding the fire, his back turned toward the room. Cordelia was mending by lamplight. Samuel and Grace sat at the table, playing cards, with a deck that had seen better years. "These were hidden," Mercy said. Zeke turned. His face went white when he saw what she held. He reached for the letters, but Mercy stepped back. "They're from your brothers. Give them here." "Why do you hide letters from family?" Samuel looked up from his cards. Even Grace had stopped writing in her notebook. The room held its breath. Zeke's voice came out rough as sandpaper. "Because they're dead." The words fell into silence. Mercy's grip on the letters loosened. She understood then why they were hidden, why this man lived alone in a house too big for one person. "How?" she whispered. "War." Cordelia set down her mending. Her own losses gave her insight into the weight this man carried. She understood the letters now, why he would keep them, but couldn't bear to see them. Samuel's hostility shifted, not gone, but redirected. A man who had lost brothers was different from a hermit who had chosen isolation. Grace opened her notebook again. But instead of writing, she studied Zeke's face. Recording not problems too. Be solved, but pain to be understood. The third day, Samuel discovered the horses. The storm had finally broken, leaving the world buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Samuel had helped Zeke dig out the barn door, working in silence beside the older man. When they finally got inside, Samuel saw the extent of the problem. 2 horses were clearly sick. Their breathing was labored, their eyes dull. A third stood apart from the others, favoring her left front hoof. Samuel moved among the animals with instinctive knowledge. His hands were gentle as he examined each. One, his earlier hostility forgotten in the face of their need. "This one has pneumonia," he said, stroking the neck of a bay mare. "The pinto has an abscess. The sorrel just needs her hoof cleaned and wrapped." Zeke watched the boy work. Samuel's anger had transformed into competence. His touch calmed the horses in ways that Zeke's had not been able to achieve. "You know horses?" Samuel nodded. "My father taught me, before the accident, before the debts, before they became refugees moving from town to town." They worked together for the first time, Samuel's knowledge combined with Zeke's supplies. The sick horses were treated, the injured one tended. By evening, all showed signs of improvement. At dinner that night, the boundaries had shifted. Not gone, but softer. Mercy asked fewer questions, understanding that some silences needed to be respected. Grace included Zeke's animals in her notebooks, recording their treatment and recovery. Cordelia watched her son work beside this broken man and saw something she had not dared hope for: stability, purpose, a future that might extend beyond simple survival. Samuel caught her watching and looked away, but his shoulders had lost some of their defensive tension. The man who had lost brothers was someone he could understand. Zeke felt the change too. The house was warmer, and not just from the fire. Voices filled spaces that had known only silence. The sound of children arguing and laughing and living reminded him of things he had buried with his brothers. That night, as the others slept in the loft above, Zeke sat alone with the returned letters. He did not read them, but he did not hide them again either. Outside, the wind carried whispers of spring still. Months away. Inside, something had begun to thaw. Grace found the letter on a Thursday morning. She had been organizing Cordelia's few possessions in the loft when her fingers discovered the folded paper tucked deep inside her mother's coat pocket. The paper was worn soft from handling, creased from being opened and refolded too many times. The handwriting was crude, the words spelled poorly. But the message was clear enough. "Mrs. Brightwater, your husband owed me $500. I know where you are. Payment or equivalent compensation is due. Jeremiah Stakes." Grace read it twice, then a third time. The words rearranged themselves into a truth she had suspected, but hoped was wrong. They were not traveling west for opportunity. They were running. Footsteps on the ladder announced her mother's return. Cordelia climbed into the loft carrying an armload of clean laundry. She froze when she saw Grace holding the letter. "How long?" Grace asked. Cordelia set down the clothes. Her hands shook as she reached for the paper. "Since your father died." "How long has he been following us?" 3 territories. "Maybe more." Samuel's voice came from behind them. He had climbed the ladder silently, drawn by the tension in their voices. "What's going on?" Grace handed him the letter. She watched. Her brother's face changed as he read. The anger she knew so well transformed into something colder. "More dangerous. We pack tonight," Samuel said. "Leave before dawn." "No." The word came out harder than Cordelia intended. "We can't keep running. We can't stay here and put him in danger." Samuel gestured toward the floor below, where Zeke was working on harness repairs. Mercy appeared at the top of the ladder. Her dreamy expression sharpened when she saw the letter in Samuel's hands. "What's that?" "Trouble," Grace said. "The kind that follows families like us." Cordelia sank onto the edge of her makeshift bed. The weight of months of running, of looking over her shoulder, of moving her children from town to town settled on her shoulders. Your father got involved with gambling. Bad men, dangerous men. When he died in that mining accident, they came. Looking for payment. Samuel crushed the letter in his fist. So we keep moving, like we always do. I'm tired of moving. The admission hung in the cold air of the loft. Mercy moved to sit beside her mother. Grace remained standing, her notebook forgotten in her lap. This place, Cordelia continued, these past weeks. It's the first time since your father died that I felt safe. Safe is an illusion, Samuel said. He found us in Colorado. He'll find us here. Grace opened her notebook. She had been tracking their movements for months, noting the towns they passed through, the people they met, the narrow escapes from men asking the wrong questions. We can't outrun this forever, she said. The money keeps running out. Winter keeps coming, and he keeps getting closer. Mercy spoke quietly. What if we told him? 3 pairs of eyes turned toward her. She was the youngest, the one they all protected from the hardest truths. But her question carried weight. Mr. Thornfield, what if we told him the truth? He'll ask us to leave, Cordelia said. Maybe, or maybe he'll help. Samuel snorted. Why would he help us? We're nothing to him. But even as he spoke the words, Samuel knew they were not entirely true. The past weeks had changed something. The way Zeke watched Samuel work with the horses, the way he listened when Mercy asked her endless questions, the way his eyes followed Cordelia as she moved through the house, bringing order to chaos. That evening, Cordelia made her decision. She found Zeke in the barn, checking on the horses Samuel had treated. The animals were recovering well under the boy's care. The sick Mare was breathing easier. The injured Pinto bore weight on her treated hoof. Zeke looked up when Cordelia entered. Lamplight flickered across his weathered face, casting shadows that made him look older than his years. I need to tell you something, she said. He straightened, already reading trouble in her posture. What's wrong? She pulled out the letter, smoothed it against her skirt. The paper felt fragile between her fingers, as if the truth might tear it apart. We're not just traveling west, we're running. She told him everything. Her husband's gambling, the debts, the men who had come looking for payment after the funeral, the months of moving from town to town, always one step ahead of trouble. Zeke listened without interruption. When she finished, silence settled between them like dust. How much? He finally asked. $500, maybe more with interest. He whistled low. It was more money than most people saw in 2 years. More than his failing ranch could produce even in good times. This man, stakes, he's dangerous. It was not a question. Cordelia nodded anyway. And you came here knowing he'd follow. I hoped he wouldn't find us. I hoped we could disappear into the mountains. Zeke walked to the barn door. Outside, snow had begun falling again. Light flakes that caught the lamplight and vanished. The mountain stood silent against the star-filled sky. You should have told me before. Would you have hired me if you'd known? He considered this. A widow with children was one thing. A woman with dangerous men hunting her was another entirely. Probably not. That's why I didn't tell you. He turned back toward her. In the lamplight she looked smaller, more fragile than the strong woman who had taken over his kitchen and brought order to his chaos. What do you want from me now? Nothing. I just thought you deserved to know before we left. You're leaving. It's safer for everyone. Zeke felt something shift inside his chest. The past weeks had reminded him what it felt like to live in a house that held voices besides his own. To sit down to meals that someone else had prepared. To watch Samuel work with the horses, to listen to Mercy's questions, to see Grace's careful observations. To feel useful again. Where will you go? West, California maybe, somewhere he can't follow. Winter's not over. Roads are still dangerous. I know. They stood in silence, each understanding what the other was not saying. That leaving now was dangerous. That staying was also dangerous. That sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Zeke made his decision. You're not going anywhere. Cordelia looked up, startled by the firmness in his voice. This is your home now, all of you. Whatever comes, we face it here. You don't understand what you're saying. This man, he won't. Just ask nicely and leave. He'll bring others. He'll use force if he has to. Then we'll be ready for him. You could lose everything. The ranch, your life. Zeke picked up a pitchfork and began spreading fresh hay in the stalls. The motion was deliberate, methodical. It gave his hands something to do while his mind processed the weight of what he was committing to. Already lost everything that mattered. Been dying slow ever since. He paused in his work, meeting her eyes across the barn. You and those children. You brought this place back to life. Maybe it's time I started living again too. Cordelia felt tears threaten at the corners of her eyes. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone choose to stand with her instead of walking away. He'll come, she said. Let him come. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of harder weather ahead. Inside the barn, two damaged people stood in the circle of lamplight and made a choice that would change everything. They would not run anymore. They would make their stand here, in this broken place that had become something precious. They would face whatever came together as family. News traveled fast in small mountain towns. The stranger had arrived in Cedar Falls 3 days ago. Tall man with pale eyes and a scar across his left cheek. He asked questions about a widow woman and her 3 children. Offered money for information. The kind of money that made honest people uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house brought the news when she came to buy eggs. She stood in Cordelia's kitchen, wringing her hands and glancing toward the door every few seconds. He's got 2 men with him, she whispered. Hard-looking types. They're staying at the saloon, asking everyone about a family that matches your description. Cordelia's hands stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. Flour dusted her fingers like snow. What did people tell him? Most folks said they hadn't seen anyone like that. But Charlie at the livery stable, he's got debts. And that man's got money. Samuel appeared in the doorway. He had been splitting wood outside, but his axe hung forgotten in his grip. His face carried the same hardness that had defined him when they first arrived. How long before he finds us? He asked. Mrs. Henderson shook her head. Day or 2 at most. Maybe less if Charlie talks. After she left, the family gathered around the kitchen table. The bank notice lay spread before them, red ink stark against white paper. 30 days remaining. The numbers seemed to mock their efforts to build something permanent. Grace opened her notebook. She had been calculating for weeks, figuring ways to save the ranch. Her neat columns of numbers told a story of hope and desperation in equal measure. The cattle, she said. We're missing too many, more than predators would take. Zeke nodded grimly. He had been tracking the losses for months. Every week brought new signs of missing livestock. Broken fences. Disturbed ground where animals had been driven away. Rustlers, Samuel said. Maybe, or maybe something else. Mercy sat quietly in the corner, no longer humming her usual songs. The weight of being hunted had settled on her shoulders, aging her beyond her 12 years. That evening, Zeke began teaching Samuel about the ranch in earnest. They walked the boundaries together as the sun set behind the mountains. Zeke pointed out landmarks, water sources, the hidden places where cattle might shelter during storms. Samuel listened with the intensity of someone memorizing vital information. This land's been in trouble for years, Zeke said. Bad luck. Bad choices, maybe both. Samuel studied the rolling pasture that stretched toward the tree line. Even in winter, he could see the potential. Good grass, clean water, protection from the worst weather. "It's not the land's fault," he said. "No, it's not." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Above them, stars began to appear, sharp points of light in the clear mountain air. "My father used to say that land remembers everything," Samuel said. "Every person who worked it, every family that called it home." He said that's why some places feel right and others don't. "This place feel right to you?" Samuel considered the question. 3 months ago, he would have said no without hesitation. The broken house, the failing ranch, the hermit who owned it. None of it had seemed like home. Now, with danger approaching and his family finally settling somewhere, he realized the answer had changed. "Yeah, it does." Inside the house, Cordelia and Zeke sat by the fire after the children had gone to bed. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller and more intimate. "I've been thinking about your brothers," Cordelia said softly. Zeke stiffened. The letters still sat on the mantel where Mercy had placed them. He had not moved them, but he had not read them either. "What about them? About why you kept their letters but couldn't bear to see them?" She was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "After my husband died, I kept his clothes, folded them neat in a trunk. But I couldn't open that trunk without falling apart." Zeke stared into the fire. The logs crackled and shifted, sending sparks up the chimney. "They were younger than me. Both of them. I was supposed to keep them safe. The war kept nobody safe. I came home. They didn't." Cordelia understood guilt. She had carried it since her husband's funeral. The weight of choices made and unmade. The terrible mathematics of survival. Maybe they would want you to read their words now. "When you're not alone anymore." The next morning brought a letter from the bank. Grace found it slipped under the door, sealed with red wax. The message was brief and brutal. Final notice. Payment due in 15 days or the property would be seized and sold at auction. The family read it in silence. Even Mercy seemed to understand the weight of those official words. Everything they had begun to build was slipping away. "There has to be something," Samuel said. "Some way to raise the money." Grace flipped through her notebook. Pages of calculations, plans, desperate hope reduced to numbers on paper. "Even if we sold everything, it wouldn't be enough." Zeke sat heavily in his chair. The bank notice felt heavier than any burden he had carried, including the weight of his brother's deaths. Losing the ranch meant losing everything, including this family that had become precious to him. That afternoon, Mercy convinced Zeke to help her write a letter. She sat beside him at the kitchen table, carefully forming words on a piece of precious paper. Her tongue stuck out slightly as she concentrated on each letter. "Who are we writing to?" Zeke asked. "Your cousin in Denver. The one your brother James mentioned in his letters." Zeke's hand stilled on his pen. "You read them." "Some of them. Before I understood they were private." She looked up at him with eyes that held more wisdom than her years should have allowed. "He wrote about you, about how proud he was, about how he hoped you'd find your way back to family someday." Zeke's throat tightened. He had assumed his brother's letters would be full of reproach. Disappointment in the brother who had survived when they had not. What did he say? Mercy recited from memory. "Tell Zeke that home isn't a place. It's the people who choose to stay when staying gets hard." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. He had spent years believing he was meant to be alone. That survival was a punishment, not a gift. "Maybe," Mercy continued carefully, "maybe they're not gone if you let their words help you now." That evening, 3 riders appeared on the horizon. Samuel spotted them first from the barn loft where he had been storing hay. He counted the men, noted their slow approach, the deliberate way they surveyed the ranch buildings. Stakes had found them. The family gathered in the Kitchen, watching through the window as the riders dismounted near the fence line. Stakes was exactly as Mrs. Henderson had described. Tall, pale-eyed, carrying himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "He's not coming to the house," Grace observed. "He's waiting." "For what?" Mercy whispered. Samuel checked the rifle that hung above the door. It was old, but clean, maintained with the care of a man who understood its importance. "For us to make the first move." Zeke stepped onto the porch. The wind carried his voice across the yard, clear and strong. "You're on private property," Stakes smiled. Even at a distance, the expression was cold as winter stone. "I'm here for what's mine, Thornfield. Send out the woman and her children. This doesn't concern you." "Everything on this ranch concerns me." "You sure about that?" "She tell you what her husband owed, what she owes now." Zeke stepped down from the porch. Each footstep carried him closer to a line he had never expected to cross. Behind him, he felt rather than saw his family watching, waiting to see what kind of man he truly was. "She doesn't owe you anything." Stakes laughed, the sound harsh as breaking glass. $500 says different, plus interest, plus expenses for tracking her across 3 territories. "She's under my protection now. Your protection." Stakes spat in the dirt. "Look around, old man. Your ranch is falling apart. Your cattle are gone. Bank's about to take everything anyway." The words stung because they were true. But truth was not always the strongest weapon. "Maybe, but until that happens, this is my land. And they're my family." Stakes' expression shifted. The casual cruelty was replaced by something harder, more dangerous. "Your family, that what you're calling it." He remounted his horse. The other 2 men followed suit, but they did not ride away. Instead, they positioned themselves where they could watch the house, the barn, the road leading to town. "I'll give you 1 night to think about it, Thornfield. Tomorrow, I come back with the law, and I take what's mine." As the 3 riders disappeared into the gathering darkness, Zeke realized they had crossed a line from which there could be no retreat. The enemy was no longer coming. He was here. Grace woke before dawn with the answer burning in her mind. She had been tracking the missing cattle for weeks, noting patterns in her careful script. The numbers told a story that nobody wanted to see. Too many animals gone. Too much coincidence in the timing. She slipped from her bed without waking Mercy and climbed down from the loft. The kitchen was empty, but lamplight flickered from Zeke's room. He had not slept either. Grace spread her notebook on the table and began connecting dots that had been scattered across months of observations. The missing cattle. The bank pressure arriving at exactly the wrong time. Stakes finding them so easily after months of successful hiding. Someone had been feeding information. Someone with money and influence and a reason to want Zeke's ranch. The answer was Marcus Carver. Zeke emerged from his room as Grace finished writing. His eyes were red with exhaustion and something deeper. The weight of standing between his family and danger. "What are you doing up?" he asked. Grace turned her notebook toward him. Pages of neat calculations and careful observations. "Mr. Carver has been stealing your cattle," Zeke frowned. His neighbor owned the largest ranch in the valley. Rich enough to buy politicians and lawmen. Powerful enough to make problems disappear. "That's a serious accusation. Look at the patterns. Cattle go missing after Carver's men ride through checking fence lines. The bank notice comes right when Stakes shows up. And somehow Stakes knew exactly where to find us." Grace's finger traced the timeline she had constructed. "Carver wants your land. He's been forcing you toward bankruptcy while making sure someone would drive us away at exactly the right moment." Samuel appeared at the top of the ladder. He had been listening from the loft, processing his sister's words. "That's why Stakes isn't in a hurry. He knows the bank will take the ranch in 2 weeks anyway." Cordelia joined them, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the morning cold. The family gathered around Grace's evidence. The truth laid out in columns of numbers and careful observations. "Even if we prove it," Cordelia said quietly, "Carver has money, influence, men who do what he tells them." "Then we get help," Mercy said from the ladder. She climbed down and moved to stand beside Zeke. "Someone who can't be bought." Grace nodded. "I sent a letter yesterday to the federal marshal in Denver. Before I understood everything, but I knew something was wrong." Zeke stared at her. This quiet girl who observed everything had been planning while the rest of them reacted. "What did you tell him?" "About the missing cattle. About men asking questions in town. About families being threatened by people claiming old debts." Samuel moved to the window. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains. "When will he get here?" "Today, maybe tomorrow." "Stakes won't wait that long." As if summoned by his name, the sound of approaching horses drifted across the morning air. Not 3 riders this time. More. Stakes had brought reinforcements. Zeke counted 6 men as they formed a line beyond the fence. Stakes sat his horse in the center, flanked by hired guns and one man in a clean suit who carried the weight of official authority. "That's Sheriff Morrison," Samuel said, "from the county seat." The sheriff rode forward, a paper folded in his hand. His voice carried across the yard with practiced authority. "Ezekiel Thornfield, I have a warrant for the arrest of Cordelia Brightwater and her children. Charges of theft and fleeing lawful debt." Zeke stepped onto the porch. Behind him, his family arranged themselves in a line, united, unafraid. "On whose complaint?" "Mr. Jeremiah Stakes, duly sworn and witnessed." Stakes smiled his cold smile. "Told you I'd be back with the law, Thornfield." But Grace had noticed something the others missed. A 7th rider approaching from the south, moving fast and alone. The federal marshal's badge caught the morning light as he reined in beside the sheriff's party. "Marshal Webb," the sheriff said, surprise clear in his voice. "What brings you to my jurisdiction?" Webb was a lean man with gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He looked at the assembled riders, then at the family standing on the porch. "Got a letter about cattle theft and extortion. Figured I'd take a look." Stakes shifted in his saddle. This was not part of his plan. Federal marshals could not be bought or intimidated as easily as local lawmen. "This is a local matter, Marshal. Civil debt collection." Webb pulled out his own papers. "Funny thing about civil debts. They don't usually require armed men and threats of violence." He rode closer to the porch, studying Grace's small figure. "You the one who wrote to me?" Grace nodded. "Yes, sir." "Smart girl. Good timing, too." Webb turned back to face Stakes and the sheriff. "I'll be investigating claims of cattle theft, extortion, and conspiracy. Until that investigation is complete, no arrests will be made." Sheriff Morrison's face darkened. "You can't interfere with a legal warrant." "Can't I?" Webb's voice carried the quiet authority of federal law. "Seems to me when local warrants coincide with organized cattle theft, that makes it my business." Stakes had heard enough. He spurred his horse forward, his men following. But instead of retreating, they spread out around the ranch buildings, surrounding the house. "Maybe it's time we settled this without all the legal complications," Stakes called out. The morning air grew thick with tension. 6 armed men against 1 federal marshal, 1 broken rancher, and a family with everything to lose. Samuel slipped back into the house and emerged with Zeke's rifle. Mercy began building something with sticks and dry grass in the yard. Grace continued taking notes, documenting everything for posterity. Cordelia moved to stand beside Zeke on the porch steps. Whatever came, they would face it together. Stakes raised his hand. His men began to dismount. The pretense of legal process had been abandoned in favor of raw force. But Mercy's small fire had begun to smoke. Thick white smoke that rose straight up in the still air. Then she added green branches, creating a signal that could be seen for miles across the valley. "What's she doing?" Stakes demanded. His question was answered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Many horses moving fast. Within minutes, riders appeared from 3 directions. Ranchers and their hands, townspeople, even Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. Mercy's smoke signal had summoned help from across the valley. People who knew Zeke, who had watched his family transform his failing ranch into something worth fighting for. Marshal Webb smiled grimly. "Looks like you're outnumbered, Stakes." But Grace was still studying the situation, still calculating odds and outcomes. Something was missing from her careful equations. "Where's Mr. Carver?" she asked quietly. As if answering her question, another group of riders crested the hill. Marcus Carver led them, flanked by more hired guns. His face carried the cold anger of a man whose careful plans had been disrupted. "Marshal Webb," Carver called out as he approached. "I see you're interfering with local business again." "Mr. Carver, funny how you show up just when things get interesting." The 2 men faced each other across the ranch yard. Federal law against local power, truth against influence. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows between the opposing forces. Grace opened her notebook one final time. She had been documenting evidence for weeks, but now she understood she had been preparing for this moment, when truth would stand trial in the harsh light of mountain justice. Stakes looked between Carver and the marshal, realizing his simple extortion had become something much larger. The family he had hunted across 3 territories had somehow become the center of a battle for the soul of the entire valley. On the porch, Zeke placed his hand on Cordelia's shoulder. Samuel stood ready with the rifle. Mercy continued feeding her signal fire. Grace prepared to present her evidence. They had started as strangers brought together by desperation. Now, they stood as family, ready to fight for the home they had built from broken pieces. The real battle was about to begin. Marshal Webb dismounted and walked to where Grace stood holding her notebook. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, dividing the armed men into patches of light and darkness. "Show me what you've got, young lady." Grace opened her notebook to pages covered with dates, numbers, and careful observations. Her handwriting was precise despite her youth, each entry a piece of evidence in the case she had been building without knowing. Mr. Carver's men ride through checking fence lines every 2 weeks. The next day, cattle go missing. Always from sections they examined. Webb studied her documentation. Months of careful record keeping. Pattern recognition that would make seasoned lawmen proud. How many head missing total? 47 over 6 months. Always small groups. Never enough to seem like organized theft. Carver spurred his horse closer. His face had gone pale under his hat brim. "That's wild speculation from a child." "Is it?" Webb continued reading Grace's notes. "She's got dates, locations, even descriptions of your men. That's Deputy Carson's horse she sketched. And that's Jake Morrison's distinctive saddle." "Sheriff." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. His own deputy was implicated in the theft. His brother Jake worked for Carver. The connections were becoming impossible to ignore. Stakes realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. "This has nothing to do with my legal claim, doesn't it?" Grace flipped to another page. "Mr. Stakes, when did you first learn?" "The Brightwater family was in Cedar Falls." Stakes hesitated. The question seemed innocent, but Grace's tone suggested otherwise. "I've been tracking them for months. Through 3 territories. Following a family that was careful to avoid main roads and large towns. How did you know exactly where to look?" The assembled crowd grew quiet. Even the hired guns seemed to sense that something important was being revealed. Grace continued her methodical dissection of the conspiracy. "Someone with local knowledge told you where we were. Someone who benefits from driving us away right when the banknote comes due." She turned to face Carver directly. Someone who's been stealing cattle to force Mr. Thornfield into bankruptcy, while arranging for us to be removed at exactly the right moment. Carver's mask of respectability finally slipped. You can't prove any of that, can't I? Grace pulled out a folded paper. This is a letter from your ranch foreman to Mr. Stakes. I found it yesterday when I was gathering eggs. One of your men must have dropped it. Webb took the letter and read it aloud. The words were damning. Detailed instructions about when to approach the ranch, how to coordinate with the bank's final notice, even suggestions about which lawmen might be sympathetic to claims of debt collection. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of Sheriff Morrison dismounting. He walked over to his deputy and held out his hand. Badge. Deputy Carson reluctantly removed his star and placed it in the sheriff's palm. The weight of corruption had finally toppled the careful structure Carver had built. Stakes saw his advantage disappearing. The legal backing he had counted on was crumbling. The local power structure that protected his methods was exposing itself as fraud. This changes nothing. The woman still owes money. Marshal Webb folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. Actually, it changes everything. Conspiracy to commit theft, extortion using falsified documents, corruption of local officials. He turned to address Stakes directly. That debt you're claiming, show me the original papers. Stakes pulled out a document from his coat. Webb examined it carefully, then handed it to Grace. Her young eyes were sharper than his aging ones, better at spotting forgeries. The ink is different, she said after a moment. Someone added numbers to change the amount owed. Webb nodded grimly. Original debt was $50. Someone added a zero and some extra charges. What was your husband's actual debt, Mrs. Brightwater? Cordelia spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. $50. To a gambling operation, Marcus Carver ran out of his saloon. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. Carver had created a false debt, hired Stakes to collect it, and arranged for the family to be driven away, just as his cattle theft forced the ranch into bankruptcy, clean, legal, and completely corrupt. Samuel stepped forward, still holding the rifle but no longer pointing it at anyone. So what happens now? Webb surveyed the crowd of armed men, the family standing united on the porch, the evidence of months of careful crime. Now we sort out who goes to jail and who goes home. The sorting took most of the morning. Stakes and his hired guns were arrested for extortion and conspiracy. Deputy Carson joined them in shackles. Sheriff Morrison retained his position but understood his tenure was being closely watched. Carver's arrest was more complicated. His lawyers would argue an appeal, but the evidence Grace had compiled was thorough. More importantly, the stolen cattle were found in a hidden pasture on his property, branded over with his mark. By afternoon, 47 head of cattle were being driven back to Zeke's ranch. The animals would provide enough income to pay the banknote with money left over for improvements. The crowd of neighbors who had answered Mercy's smoke signal stayed to help. Fences were repaired, buildings straightened. The work of community applied to healing what isolation had damaged. As sunset painted the mountains red and gold, the Thornfield Ranch looked different. Not just the physical improvements, but something deeper. The sense of belonging that came from people choosing to invest their labor in someone else's future. Spring arrived early that year. The snow melted sooner than expected, revealing ground that had been frozen for too long. Green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, reaching toward warmth and light. Zeke stood in the pasture where Samuel was training a young horse. The boy had grown into his role as ranch foreman, his natural gift with animals complemented by hard-won knowledge of the land. Mercy had convinced Zeke to write letters to his surviving relatives, cousins in Denver who remembered him fondly, an aunt in Kansas who had wondered for years what became of her brother's boys. The connections that war and grief had severed were slowly being rewoven. Grace ran the ranch's business affairs with the precision of someone twice her age. Her notebooks had expanded to include breeding records, financial projections, and correspondence with buyers as far away as California. Cordelia had become the heart of the transformed household. Her presence in the kitchen, her voice calling them to meals, her quiet strength that anchored them all. She and Zeke had grown into partnership built on shared work and deeper understanding. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday in late April. Zeke had petitioned the territorial court to adopt all 3 children, to give them his name and make them his legal heirs. The approval came with official seals and formal language, but the meaning was simple. They were family now, forever and legally bound. That evening, they gathered at the small cemetery where Zeke's brothers were buried. Cordelia brought flowers for her husband's marker, erected the previous month when they finally had money for proper stone. Zeke pulled out a letter, one of many he had written but never sent. This one was different. Addressed to James and Thomas Thornfield, wherever they might be watching from. He read it aloud in the fading light. Words about survival and guilt, and the unexpected gift of finding family when he had given up looking. About how their deaths had taught him the value of life, even when the lesson took years to understand. The letter spoke of Samuel's skill. With horses, Mercy's gift for bringing people together, Grace's sharp mind that saw truth in tangled situations. It described Cordelia's strength and kindness, the way she had transformed a broken house into a home. "I thought I'd lost everything when you died," he read. "But somehow you led me to something I never expected. Not just survival, but joy." When he finished, they stood in comfortable silence. The mountains rose around them, eternal and protective. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky, sharp points of light that would guide travelers home. The wind carried the scent of growing things, of hope planted in ground that had been fallow too long. They walked back to the house together, 5 people who had chosen each other when choice seemed impossible. The lonely rancher who had hired a starving widow to repair his clothes had indeed found family forever. The light in their windows shone, warm and golden, a beacon visible across the entire valley. Inside, voices rose in conversation and laughter, the sounds of people who belonged to each other and to the land they called home. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.